Assalamu alaikum everybody, welcome. آج کا ہمارا سیشن کا نام ہے آ جاؤ افریقہ. My name is Aisha Sarwari. I'm very glad to have you here today with us. Before we start, I wanted to play a video called آ جاؤ افریقہ. یہ فیض صاحب کا ایک کورس پوئم تھی جو انہوں نے لکھی تھی افریقہ کے بارے میں. یہ انہوں نے 1955 میں لکھی تھی منگمری جیل سے, اینڈ دس واز اے ریلنگ کرائی فار دی اینٹی کلونیل فورسز ان افریقہ. سو اس کی جو اسٹائل آف ایکسپریشن ہے یہ بہت ڈفرینٹ ہے فرام واٹ ہی یوزلی ہیز ان ہز پوئٹری. اور انہوں نے ایلس کو ایک لیٹر میں یہ پوئم لکھ کے بارے میں یہ کہا تھا کہ اس کا اسٹائل اتنا انکنونشنل ہے کہ آئی ایم شیور کہ جو پوئٹس, جو بڑے بڑے پوئٹس ہیں وہ کافی ناراض ہوں گے اس کی اسٹائل پہ, but I don't care. So it was so important for him that he expressed this poem in exactly this sense of expression. So I'd like to request that the video Aa Jao Africa by Ahmed Faiz is played now.
Aa Jao Africa, Aa Jao, Aa Jao, maine sun li tere dhol ki tarang. Aa Jao, mast ho gayi mere lahu ki taal. آ جاؤ افریقہ, آ جاؤ افریقہ, آ جاؤ افریقہ, آ جاؤ میں نے دھول سے ماتھا اٹھا لیا. آ جاؤ میں نے چھیل دی آنکھوں سے غم کی چھال. آ جاؤ میں نے درد سے بازو چھڑا لیا. آ جاؤ میں نے نوچ دیا بے کسی کا جال. آ جاؤ افریقہ, پنجے میں ہتھ کڑی کی کڑی بن گئی ہے گرز. گردن کا توق توڑ کے ڈھالی ہے میں نے ڈھال. آ جاؤ افریقہ, جلتے ہیں ہر کچھار میں بھالوں کے مرگ نین. دشمن لہو سے رات کی کالک ہوئی ہے لال. آ جاؤ افریقہ, دھرتی دھڑک رہی ہے میرے ساتھ افریقہ. دریا تھرک رہا ہے تو بن دے رہا ہے تال. میں افریقہ ہوں, دھار لیا میں نے تیرا روپ. میں تو ہوں, میری چال ہے تیری ببر کی چال. آ جاؤ افریقہ, آؤ ببر کی چال. آ جاؤ افریقہ.
This is a very beautiful poem. اور ہم دیکھتے ہیں کہ جب پاکستان میں یا ایشیا میں جنرلی افریقہ کی بات ہوتی ہے تو ایک اسٹیریوٹیپیکل انڈرسٹینڈنگ بنتی ہے افریقہ کے بارے میں, جنگلات کی اور ایک سورٹ آف انریسٹ کی. لیکن فیض صاحب نے اس کانٹیننٹ کے نیوانسز کو بہت خوبصورتی سے سمجھا ہے. آج کی ہماری گیسٹ فیروزے بلبلے ہیں. شی از اے ویری ویل ریناؤنڈ فلم میکر, اور ان کے بارے میں تھوڑی سی میں بایو ان کی بتا دیتی ہوں. انہوں نے ماسٹرز کیا ہے افریقن اسٹڈیز سے فرام اوہایو یونیورسٹی, بی اے فرام ڈراماٹک آرٹس آنرز فرام وٹس یونیورسٹی ساؤتھ افریقہ. She's got a teacher's diploma in English from Trinity College. She's an award-winning film media producer, director, as well as a trainer. She's got 5 feature films. آپ انڈرسٹینڈ کر سکتے ہیں کہ فیچر فلم بنانا کتنا مشکل ہوتا ہے, اور ان کے 5 ہیں. ابھی ان کا لیگیسی پروجیکٹ ہے فارمر ساؤتھ افریقن پریزیڈنٹ نیلسن منڈیلا کا منڈیلاز افریقہ, اور انہوں نے ساؤتھ افریقہ اٹالین فیچر فلم کے اوپر ابھی کام کر رہی ہیں, لبریشن. I'd like to call Firdoze Bulbulia, please. Thank you so much for being here at the Faiz Festival today. It's an honor for us, for you to have traveled all the way from Johannesburg for this session. It's very clear from your work that you have a very keen sense of social justice. Can you tell me when it started? How young were you? Was it a particular day? Was it something you read? Was it something that was just intrinsically born with you, that you traveled with? When was that exact moment that you realized, this is the journey I need to take?
I think if you know the political history of South Africa and apartheid South Africa, where people lived separately and apart, and in South Africa we have 4 race groups, white, and they probably make up 8% of the population, and then black South Africans who are about 80% of the population, and we have colored, which is mixed race between white and black, and they're probably about 4%, and then you have Indians, so I'm Indian South African, and we make up 2% of the population, very small. Our politics as South African Indians is really determined by Mahatma Gandhi, who came and spent a lot of time in South Africa. And so I like to explain to people that before the African National Congress, there was actually the Indian Congress. And it was through Mahatma Gandhi that Indian South Africans didn't have to carry a passbook, which was your identity. Wherever you went, you had to show this ID document. So for me as a 12-year-old being at primary school, I witnessed the separation between races, and I couldn't quite understand it. And I remember, my grandmother saying, "No, you can't sit on that bench in a park." And the bench said whites only. And it was really very strange for me as a kid to say that those were places we couldn't go to. And so my first real interaction was as a 13, 14-year-old. I had just started high school, and the 76 uprisings were taking place in South Africa. So this was when students in South Africa decided that they were going to fight the system. And they were basically fighting the fact that they were forced to be taught in Afrikaans. So Afrikaans became a medium of instruction. They were being taught mathematics and science and every subject in Afrikaans. And they said, "It's enough now, we don't want to do this anymore." And so they took to the streets. And so for me, I started to read different books, particularly books that at the time was banned in South Africa. So Frantz Fanon was very important to me, White Skins, Black Masks. And the idea of how we as black people were trying very hard to assimilate into a culture that really wasn't ours. And therefore how we ought to be proud of who we are as Africans. And this is a difficult thing for me because I call myself an African. And people say, "But you don't look African. What do you mean?" And I think being born in South Africa, and even though I'm 3rd generation Indian, I am entrenched in the culture and the life of South Africa. And therefore I am a black South African. It's also what Mandela said. Nelson Mandela spoke about everybody that was not white was black. So coloreds and Indians were also classified as black. So we're all black. So I think the moment for me of injustice, the moment of saying, why am I different? Why am I treated differently? Why can't I sit on that bench? Why can't I play in that park? Children, we couldn't play in a park. We couldn't play on the swings. You walked around the park and there were all these white children who were playing and you couldn't enter.
You were outside looking in.
Yeah, and you'd have a big, like a big burly man, white man, who was the caretaker, and was making sure that you don't come and play in a park. So I think that kind of, it jolts you, it shocks you. Even though I think what's important to say is that in a segregated South Africa, we also grew up in separate areas. So Indians lived in an Indian area, whites in a white area, coloreds in a colored area, and blacks in a black area. So you never really mixed. And the first time I think I mixed with people of other races was in my final year of high school. I was 17, 18 years old. So it's the first time that you began to see other people of another race as an equal to you. Because as an Indian child, your only interaction with black people would be as servants, as people working for you. And white people were like, they were the most important people. They owned everything. Indian people, I think, as we would know generally, in terms of the subcontinent, is that people work very hard, and so they would be in business and they would have moved up, upwardly mobile because of their hard work, and therefore would own businesses. But the businesses had to be under the name of a white person. So in order to trade in certain parts of the country, you had to have a white pseudonym or a nominee. And in some cases, the white business person could steal your business because it's on his name. And so there were all these very challenging ways in which I think as Indian South Africans, we had to negotiate our space within South Africa. But the Mahatma Gandhi experience is a big one because through Mahatma Gandhi, we understood our sense of being. And that with him and his fight and his resistance against apartheid, I think made South African Indians much stronger.
Let me ask you, so I understand Indian South Africans were sort of like in the middle of the pecking order, if I must use that word, where there were the whites who owned everything and who owned the land and the property and were calling the shots and were the elite. And then there were the Africans who were, the black Africans who were the workers and the servants and, you know, the whatever derogatory names that you would refer to them as. What are some of the adjectives that you would use for whites who did that? And what are some of the adjectives that you, not you as in now with, you know, all your nuance, but at that point as a child?
Well, I think as a child, my dad owned, my dad was in textile, and so he had a firm, you know, an industry of textile. And one day I was sitting with him and he said to me, "Can you just call the boys?" Those
The
were men.
boys. Mm.
He said, "Can you call the boys to come and eat or something?" And I looked around and I said, "I don't see any boys, Dad." And my father always used that as an example. It almost makes me emotional. Because he said, he obviously grew up seeing these men, and the narrative was to call grown-up men boys, and women who worked in your home the girl.
The girls.
And he said, I had, as a 12-year-old or 10-year-old, said to him, "But I don't see any boys around, Dad." And he said that made him realize that he had to change. And I think, you know, part of that is, as our parents, I think it's very hard when our parents say things that you don't believe in and you think it's so wrong. But do you say to them, do you say, "Hey, Dad, you can't speak like that"? But it was quite innocent for me. It wasn't me thinking, I wasn't belittling my father. I was just like, "Where are the boys? I don't see any boys around." And so the narrative changed in our home, where we would not call adult men and women girls and boys, but that was the language. So little white children would call the maid or the nanny who looked after them the girl.
Or the
And
boy.
so would Indians. You know, the garden boy, the tea, you know, there was no lady. It was boy and girl. And I think even today South Africa does it. So even though we're in a transition, we're in a democracy, things have changed, I think what's in the DNA, what is so latent and so deep, has not changed. So change in discourse, change in the way that we frame things, the way that we say, the way that we communicate is really important. But it really needs to change from when we are little.
One of the things that we were talking about earlier is I grew up in East Africa, in Uganda and Kenya, and one of the things we saw there was this deep-rooted sense of violence that came out of Idi Amin's time. You know, the Indians in East Africa were particularly very racist towards the Africans, the black Africans. How much does the caste system of the Indian tradition and culture play into what's happening in South Africa, for instance, or perhaps even in East Africa?
I think East Africa is a different example. I think in South Africa, and I go back to the Mahatma Gandhi period, because I think that education for a lot of South African Indians was important. And because we were such a minority, being 2%, it was possible that people were kind of trained almost differently. So the caste, I don't think it worked in that same way. But in Natal, in KwaZulu-Natal, where you have more Indian South Africans vying for the same jobs as black South Africans, in 1948 there was quite a bloodshed between the two communities. And even today, if I go to Durban, you feel it. My husband is Nigerian, so he's black. And we have these funny jokes about, you know, him going in and people thinking he's my driver or he's the boy, you know, he's carrying my bags. And it's just so funny. So you know, Michael Jackson came to perform in South Africa, and I work in media and whatever. So somebody had left tickets for us at the hotel. And I was driving, so I said to my husband, just, you know, pick up the tickets there under my name. And he goes there and he says to the guy who's Indian at the reception, "I've come to collect tickets for Firdoze, Bulbulia." And the guy looks at him and says, you're not Firdoze Bulbulia, because you're black, so what, you're not a Bulbulia. And he comes up like furious. He's like, I can just hit that guy, and we laugh about it. Because I think that is so deep, so between, and we see particularly in Durban. So, even if we go to a restaurant and we're sitting together, just the attitude between the people who are serving us is so strange. So for me, it's been an interesting journey because being Indian, and I don't look Indian, so they assume immediately that I'm white. And then they see this black man next to me. So there's already in their minds a way in which they will behave with us.
Firdoze, do you feel exhausted sometimes from all the identities that you're carrying and all the identities that you see people projecting on yourself and perhaps even your husband? Is there a time where you feel, like you heave?
I think there are times when I feel angry. There was a time we were in Cape Town at a supermarket, and my husband had walked in, and there was this little, probably a 4-year-old white boy who said to my husband, "I'm watching you." And that was like, in case you want to steal, I'm watching you. And this was probably 10 years ago. So we were already in a new South Africa. And my husband laughs. He was born in Nigeria and grew up in the UK. So he's very affirmed. And so when I'm ready to get really angry, he just laughs. And he says, "Why does it bother you? It's their baggage, it's their problem. You shouldn't carry it." I think because I'm so much of an activist, as a student, when you talk about my activism, so by the time I got to high school and my final year of high school, I actually ended up in jail because I was part of the protests in 1980, and we were fighting the system, the apartheid system, and I was one of the student leaders. So what we call the special branch came to my door at 4 a.m. and that's usually what they would do. They'd come at 4 o'clock in the morning when you're all confused, they bang on the door and they were looking for me. And we're a family of 9 children. So I'm the 3rd eldest, and my dad opened the door and he was like, the police had come looking for Firdoze Bulbulia, and he's trying to say, "I don't live there." And he wants to point up the road, but up the road, my cousin, whose name is Firdoze, lives there, and he thinks, oops, he can't say there because, they could confuse us. Anyway, the police come in, they bang everything, they rampage everything.
How old are you at this time?
I'm about 17, 18, so it's final year of high school. And they rummage through all my things, and they pick me up at 4 a.m. and drive me all the way to Soweto. And if you know South African history, you know Soweto is one of the most important townships. And that's where they were rounding up all the student leaders. And then took me to what was then called John Vorster Square, which was the police station. And if you know the South African history, there was a teacher called Ahmed, who was killed in detention. And he was thrown down 10 floors from John Vorster. So for me, as a young student, female, going into John Vorster, my entire family thinking, there's a history, there's a legacy. People were really terrified, and so were we. We were student activists, and we knew we wanted to change the system. But we also knew that it was dangerous. And we were beaten up, and we were, it was a difficult period. But it was something that I endured, and I think it's something that's made me stronger. So when you say, am I tired? I don't think I'm fatigued. I think a lot of the work that I do since has always dealt with a political nuance. So I do theater, I do film, I do media training, I travel around the world every 2 weeks out of a month. I'm in another country doing this or training or showing films, because I think it's important that we get the message out there, and that you need to have people who really feel the message. And having lived the message, I think that's what I'm doing, is continuously living the message.
I have so much to ask you, but would you like to give our audience an example of your work?
Can we show that clip now? So what I'm going to show you is Cry of Love. And this came out of a series of work that we did for UNICEF. In 2000, UNICEF did a thing called Violence Against Children, and basically asked us as a company to travel to about 5 African countries to document violence against children. So we had violence in the home. So in Madagascar, it was basically
Child servants, perhaps?
the child who worked for the, well, you know, it was his brother, the older brother was married, and he had to take care of his younger brother. And the wife who had her own children was not happy that this little kid, who was her brother's little brother, that she had to take care of. So she basically tied him almost like an animal around the corner of the house and fed him, you know, it was really sad. So he was a 12-year-old who looked like he was 6. He was so malnourished. So that was in Madagascar. In Ethiopia, we did what they call marriage by abduction, where the boy in the one village likes the girl in the other village, and he can just steal her. He steals her, he takes her to his village, he circumcises her, marries her, and then, you know, she's his. And then in Uganda, and you've lived in Uganda, was the whole thing with child soldiers, with Kony. So we took all of these very difficult topics and we placed it in a film as an edutainment, so that we could, through entertaining, we could talk about very difficult issues. So if we can show the clip, you'll see that the young people are not actors, the older generation are, but really the fuse between them, and it's done in a real fun way. Johannesburg, City of Gold, also known as Igoli, the richest metropolis in sub-Sahara Africa, a cultural hub and vibrant city with 4 million inhabitants. This is the city most Africans want to live in.
One, two, three, 4.
You have talent.
Ubuntu. This is what we should be preaching.
Say what you want to say. Be who you want to be. Do what you want to do.
Everyone here is talking about Ubuntu. And yet I don't see these BEE types going back to the townships and giving back to the places that they come from.
Say what you want to.
I'm the king of this place.
One rightful hand.
No one will come in here, not even the Messiah, and take the young kids off the streets and mess up my business infrastructure. No one.
Who will you be now?
Kana uchema ndinonzwa moyo wangu kurazeba. Kana uchema ndinonzwa moyo wangu kurazeba. Welcome, my children. It has always been my dream to have an African sanctuary.
Sanctuary?
Where all these children could come from different countries and no one will ever judge them. They come with talent. You know, arts and culture is the ultimate. They could sing, they could dance, they could play instruments, no one will ever judge them. They'll all come together as African children.
He taught me how to watch and play.
You rich people, all the same. It's not like you poor people are any better. I should have known better than to come here with you.
Then go back to Uganda.
Fine,
Go.
I'm leaving.
Watch and play.
Word is out that you've started a school and
Shame, man, you're feeling out of place, I'm sure.
Free your mind and express yourselves. This is what this school is all about.
Free your mind and express yourself. Free your mind and the rest will follow.
I think happiness is the cure for everything. If there's a drop of happiness somewhere, it can spread and it can become a beautiful thing. What I'm going to bring is a smile. I'm going to bring passion. I'm going to bring happiness. I surround myself with that, and I give off and I feed off of it. It is my life source in life. For my soul, happiness is the sole sustenance to my existence.
And darling, darling, stand by me. Oh, stand by me. Just as long as you stand by me. Woo, yeah!
I'm Olufemi.
Olufemi.
Yeah. And I know very soon you'll know about that name, Olufemi.
You just call on my name, and you know wherever I am, I'll come running, see you again.
We would like to tell you our story. We are former child soldiers.
I've been in pain so long now. I'm glad you're here to listen. I've cried so many nights, but I've never felt some love from no mama. Mother, oh mama, please dry my tears. Mother, oh mama, please dry my tears. Mama, oh mama, please hold me tight. Mother,
Gonna be alright, it's gonna be okay. Just look right over your shoulder, I'll be there. There's a reason you made it this far. I'm so proud of who you are. Now let the world see what is hidden in your heart. You can do this.
Firdoze, I think that was beautiful, especially the use of music to kind of allow the message to go forth. Given that this is the Faiz festival, I want to draw Faiz Saab in. In your work, you've felt that there have been a lot of parallels between Faiz Ahmed Faiz and Nelson Mandela, and you're making a feature film on Nelson Mandela at the moment. What are those parallels?
I was saying, I think we're saying that what Faiz has written is so kind of important now, and he'd written it so many decades ago. And I guess it's the same thing with Mandela, is that unfortunately we haven't transitioned. As a people, it should not be relevant today, because by today we should all be completely democratic and life should be good for everybody. But it isn't. And so you have these leaders who at their time were writing things saying, this is probably how we should be changing, what we should be doing, how we should be living. And we find that that hasn't really happened. So the parallel for me, I think, is that you have good people, you have stalwarts like these who guide us and give us a vision and say to us, this is what we should be doing. And then you're sitting in 2016, almost 2017, and you're saying, my goodness, we haven't managed. So that's the parallel. It's what is the bait and what do we do? What do we, all of us individually, how do we take this forward? In the extract that you saw there, that's a short version of the film. The film is 2 hours long, and if you saw the little boy and girl, when they say, we want to tell you our story, we were former child soldiers. This was a real story. I was interviewing this little girl who was 16 years old, and she was in the interview situation, and the next thing she gets up, and I'm like, what's happening? And her mind says, oh, you know, she's just so disorganized and irritated. In the meantime, she was 16, she had a baby, and she was a child soldier and was a wife of the soldiers. So when she was so highly pregnant during the Lord's Resistance Army, she was of no use to them. So basically, she manages to escape. Her brother, who at the time was also a child soldier, she plans the escape. She says to him, because they were going to raid a village again, and she says, tonight, when they raid the village, you need to jump in there was a big pit that they dug. And she says, hide in that pit. I will come to fetch you, and from there we will carry on. And that is really how they managed to escape. So whilst I'm interviewing her, she's telling me the story, and then she leaves the interview. I mean, she just gets up, and the cameras are rolling, and everybody's waiting, and she goes basically to check on her baby. She wanted to see that the baby wasn't hungry. And at the time, I had a 16-year-old daughter who was at school. So the kinds of parallels of you as a mother, as a teacher, as a trainer, as a wife, as a daughter, interacting with other young people whose lives have been cut short in that they're not your normal child. They've picked up guns, they've killed people. One of the boys who was 19, I was having the interview, and he was looking at me and he said, right now, I can talk to you, but tonight I will see every one of those 19 people that I killed. I see their faces. And I think that kind of trauma is really horrific. And for us to engage in that, I mean, as storytellers, to be there. Another example would be the HIV/AIDS series. You know, we filmed in about 10 African countries, and you engage with the subject long before you get there because you prepare in months in advance. And then as we got there to one of the places, the lady who had decided to talk to us had died. And we discovered that she was poisoned by her family because they didn't want her to tell the story. So as a storyteller, do you take that, do you carry that, you know, what do you do with that? And then in another case, there was this woman in Ethiopia who said to us, part of when you're AIDS, when the HIV has almost moved into AIDS, and when you're AIDS ill, there's dementia, you get crazy really, you're mad. And part of it is that you imagine things. So she had decided that she was this huge star and that we were a camera crew that was coming to film her life. It was almost like a dream in a way. You know, she was all dressed up and so forth. And I had to say to her, but have you told your family? Do they know that you are positive? And she says, no. I said, but then why do you want to tell me? Because if I put you on camera, this will go around the world. It will probably show in your country. So have you thought about it? So part of it is also how do you say to the subject who has imagined that she's bigger than life, to say, are you sure you want this? And so she set up this big performance, which we filmed, but we never showed. Because I think that I didn't think as a storyteller that it was the right story to tell, because I didn't think that she had internalized how much of that story would go out. And I think part of this, and when you talk about Faiz or you talk about Mandela, I think what they do is they tell you in a way to be real and true to yourself, to do what your conscience dictates. And sometimes we are dictated by greed and corruption and money. And I think what we have to do is to be dictated by the conscience, by the truth. And what is the truth? Because we all have our truth. We all have our baggage. But really to find a way in which you explore as conscientiously as possible what that truth is. And so in some cases, I just thought that that was something I didn't want to share. And I didn't think that we should share it with the world if she hadn't managed to share it with her family. Sometimes it's easier to tell a story to an outsider than to tell it to your family, as you know. But I think in doing that, we have to be practical and we need to be real and honest about what it is.
These stories that you've just outlined, especially the two child soldiers that we saw, I couldn't fathom that they were actually anything but children, you know. And so it was so powerful that they went through what they went through, and then they lived to tell. When you go through these stories, how do you talk to me about art and hope? And this is something that was in Faiz's poetry constantly, and it was in, you know, the freedom work of Mandela. What makes you as an artist, and what makes these great people continue to hope when there's despair and there's violence and there's a continuous onslaught of it?
I think we have to hope. If we don't have hope, this morning the lady Safina who fetches me had witnessed a car accident. A guy on a motorbike and a Prada, you know, and the guy who knocked this man just continued driving. And she came really frazzled and shaken. And she said, you know, that's what happens in these places. And you wonder, without me, you know, referring to what these places are, because these places are our places. They are places of despair, and they are places of struggle, and they are places of fear. But they are places of hope. Because somebody did come, the police came, and the ambulance was there, and there were people who came around and they carried him and they took him, you know, and that is the hope. Because otherwise we're all going to sit in a corner somewhere and say nothing's going to happen. But we, as the storytellers, as the creatives, we have to have hope. We have to look in the darkest corners of where there is despair, of me sitting in prison and thinking, how do I get out of here? What am I going to do? I've left my family behind, my mother, my dad. You know, so your thinking is about the people outside, and you know that they depend on you to be strong and to feel better and to move on. It's also taking the stories of the girl child, of these child soldiers, of the little girl who has had a baby, of the girl who is married through abduction. You know, I listened to her, and in the Ethiopian struggle, you know, Ethiopians are very strong, very fast runners. I don't know if you've seen that globally, right? They run really well. So this girl had thought that her brother lived in Chicago, and we filmed with her in Ethiopia. She thought that she would be a runner. That was her dream. Her hope was to run internationally. Unfortunately, in the tradition of marriage by abduction, the boy in the village, one village, liked her, so he was from another village. So he chases her. He wants to catch her, and he wants to marry her. And this is what UNICEF calls harmful traditional practices, because it's a practice that is allowed in those communities. But she's so fast that it takes him 3 days with all his friends to chase her. Eventually they do catch her. They capture her. And her uncle, who is the sheriff of her town, hears her crying, but he can't stop it, because if he stops it, he would be ostracized, because it's a cultural practice that's allowed. So he hears her crying, and she's been dragged across to the other village. And when she gets there, she is immediately, as I said to you, circumcised, married, and this is her husband. And she dreams every day of her escape. And she manages to escape. So when she tells me the story, I imagine the film. I could see the film of her going to the water, of her bathing, getting ready, and looking for the opportunity when she can escape. And it happens the day the mother, her mother-in-law, and the son are out. I think they've gone to probably buy something. And she manages to escape. She runs across, and she crosses the river, and she does this whole thing. But when she goes home, her mother doesn't want her, because she will bring shame to the family, because she's already married. She's already had that process. So nobody else will marry her. And therefore she has to go back. And she doesn't want to go back. And her mother pretends, and her mother says, no, don't worry, you know, we're sorting it out. And basically her mother calls her husband back, and they take her. Now, in that situation, if there's no hope for her, she will not try to escape again, which she does. And she manages, so that's why I'm able to interview her. And she's now in a different environment where she is safe. She's in a safe house, which was the same for the child soldiers. You know, they are stolen by the Lord's Resistance Army and taken to fight in the war. But partly they are sent back to the village, and they sent back to their own village to plunder and rape and steal. And so basically they ask these boys to rape their own sisters, their mothers, the people that they know. And the reason they do that is so that those children will never go back to that village. So you've been stolen from the village to fight in the war, but if you manage to escape, how do you go back to a village where you have done such atrocities? So basically, that is the way in which Coney works. So he plays with their heads that way. And then I think if you just Google the Lord's Resistance Army or the war in Uganda, you will see really stark images of people without noses and ears and eyes. And part of what these child soldiers are asked to do is to chop off the ear and the nose and pull out the eyes. And it's saying, because you saw too much, or you heard too much, or you smelled too much. So when you have been through such an atrocity, it is really very hard for you to go back to your home. And so what they did, where we filmed with these young people in Uganda, is a safe home where they're preparing them to integrate into the community. But the children are afraid to go to the community. So they try to bring the parents to meet the children first. And it's a long process. It's many, many months of engaging. Imagine this is your own mother, but you're afraid, because when you're a child and you do something naughty and your mother gives you a spanking, you know that that's going to be a problem. But this is not about a spanking. This is something really bad that you've done, and you can never heal that. You can never have closure on that. And how do you then witness that and work through that process? And so I think for me anyway, you know, having I always related to my daughter. My daughter's 29 now, but at the time, you know, she was 16 and 17 and 14. And so every time I was filming with these young people, I was seeing my child, and I was thinking, how do you explain this? How do you, for myself, yes, and for the audience, but for a child, you know? After I filmed in Addis in Ethiopia with caregivers who had decided to work in HIV and AIDS, and all they were given were bicycles. So you're not being paid, but you're given a bicycle, and you are trained on how to work with people who are AIDS ill, so how to bathe them, how to prepare them. And when I came out of that, I sat in the vehicle, in the van, and I stopped for a moment, and I thought, I just need time off. Like, oh, you need to heal. You need to take time. You need to regroup, as they say. And so I went to Ohio University, and I did my master's there, because it was like, you are confronted daily with these very difficult stories, which are very important to tell, and which obviously grow you as a person, and is very important. But you could become completely exhausted.
I sense that, yeah. I sense that, and that's why I asked you about that question about when is it overwhelming, because there's now new research about how journalists who are storytellers have PTSD,
yes,
have anxiety or disorders, because how much can you detach from your subject? How much can you detach from the story you're telling? You become the story. You absorb the pain. And
absolutely,
we thank you for it,
yeah,
because you've brought the stories all the way to Lahore for us to hear. And these stories, you know, are us now.
Yeah.
Firdoze, talk to me about male privilege, because we've talked about white privilege, we've talked about race in a lot of detail. And these stories that you're telling me have something to do with women's stories, and how, when it comes to war and violence, women are disproportionately affected. However, they're not given the same representation on the table for negotiation. They're not given space in stories, unlike yours, where there are a lot of women, but most of our contemporary stories are absent. You know, they talk about how violence affects men. They don't talk about how, you know, it affects women, and they don't bring women into the peace process. But I want to understand myself also. What is male privilege? How have you seen it manifest? And how can storytellers turn it around?
Well, I think we know that rape is a form of especially in war, is another form of violence, and that has been used. Rape has been used so often. I think personally there is always this I think I have a voice, and I think I need to use it, and I need to project it, and I need to be a voice for other women. And so I've always done that, and I've always felt strong enough. My dad is late, but he was a very strong supporter of my voice, you know. And I think that I was actually telling you about a story right now. I'm a shareholder in a company, and we are 5 shareholders, one of them being a white male. And I was explaining to Aisha, just his language, just the way he talks to me, is so framed in the discourse of an old South Africa, where white people would talk to us in a particular way, or that men would talk to us in a particular way. And so I find myself butting heads all the time, and at some point it's tiring. I want to say, I don't need this. And then I realize I do need this, and I do need to shut you up, and I do need to tell you that we are equal. And that just because you are white or man doesn't mean that I lose my voice. And that I think the other thing that I've been lucky is that my voice is very articulate. I'm very clear. I'm very sure. I'm very informed. I read a lot. I had this example the other day with my daughter, who is a lawyer and a wonderful young woman. But in South Africa at the moment, we've got the Fees Must Fall campaign, where students have taken to the streets, and literally we burn in libraries and universities. And what these young people are saying is that we, the Mandela generation, have sold out, that we didn't fight for a decolonized education, that we've allowed through the Rainbow Nation in the process of negotiation, we didn't actually fight for their rights as we ought to have. And being the complete activist that I am, I was saying to my daughter, yes, this is good, these students must stand up and they must have this fight. And she said, but Mom, you're always pushing your point of view, and you're not allowing, because we argue, and she says, you're not allowing me my voice. And I said, well, you need to read. And she says, I do read. I said, well, have you read Frantz Fanon? And she goes, no. And I said, well, so I'm not pushing my point of view. I'm giving you an informed point of view, because I did read Fanon, and I read Fanon when I was 12. So because your struggle, her struggle is not my struggle, thank goodness for that, that it's a new South Africa and things are better. Our struggle was so entrenched and so deep and so hard won, but we had to learn, we had to study, we had to read, we had to know what we are doing. And when I look at all these wonderful young people around us who are so overtaken by this piece of machinery, it's really scary, because you have to be more than this. You have to be more than the like on your Facebook and the tweet, of I don't know how many characters. You have to be deeper, you have to be more informed, and you need to read. And I think that if that is the message, which I think Faiz would have said, and Mandela would say, and other leaders would say, is really prepare yourself for battle. And the best way to prepare, for me as a storyteller, to prepare myself, is to research and research and research. When you say to young people, when we do training, what's the most important process of storytelling? Research. The second most important, research. The third most important, research. Because once you have the full research, you can write, you can perform, you can draw, you can do whatever you have to do. But you've done the back work, which is really, really hard, and that's what you have to do. And then I think is that when you're in the space, is really to be humble and to connect. And the best way is to try to connect with the people who are in your audience, in your space, in them understanding who you are, and you knowing who they are. Because sometimes, when we have a microphone, we don't want to hand it over to somebody else because it's my time. I tend to like to know who I'm talking to and to share that space. So I'm sorry, because we wanted this to be quite interactive, and I don't know if there were questions from people.
We'll take a few questions at the end.
Okay.
I just want you to end with one scenario. I want you to tell us what the most ideal situation would look like, because you're a storyteller, you help us visualize. What would the ideal world look like?
Wow. The ideal world in a physical world? Or what would you mean? I think the ideal world would be where we are, where I don't think we can all ever be equal, whatever that means. But I think the ideal world is a place of respect. I don't like the word tolerant. I don't think I need to tolerate you. I think I need to respect you. I think whoever you are, whoever you believe in, as long as we have a strong humanity, I think that's important. One of the things that I did do when we talk about trauma for journalists, I went on a project which is a meditation retreat called Peace In, Peace Out, and it was a whole week of really trying to meditate, of trying to get to terms with what we go through as storytellers and the challenges that we see in the world. Because I think we have to be silent. I struggle to be silent. I think in silence we manage to regroup, and you manage then to exhale, which we need to do.
Do you feel that sometimes the storytellers are...
I think it is cathartic. I think it's important. It's a release. I think sometimes people just talk because they want to be heard, and it's important. I think sometimes, though, when I'm working in an interview, I'm having to drag the story out, which can be a bit more difficult.
Okay, next question here. So how do you reconcile that?
You know, it's very interesting because it's just come up now again in South Africa, and particularly with the fees must fall and young people saying we want a decolonized education. And Mahatma Gandhi, as you know, is an icon globally, not only in South Africa. So that language has come through. And I think somebody put it on Facebook the other day, a black South African woman, and she said, I'll just park this here for a while. And it's shocking. I reconcile it in terms of context. And it's like I said to you about my father calling the worker a boy. I don't think he meant it. I don't think he means he's a boy. But I think the context and the narrative and the discourse of that period allowed that kind of talk. And therefore, I rationalize it. I don't think it's correct at all.
I must say, Firdoze, it has been an immense pleasure. I think that there are very few people in the world that are as authentic as you. It's been a pure delight. If I'd, give her a warm welcome and a thank you from Lahore. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Aisha.